Welcome everyone, and welcome to the seventh of our webinars on the HTA's revised codes and standards. This is our webinar on the revised Anatomical Examination Code and Standards. I know some people also registered for our previous webinars, so welcome back. I hope you're finding these useful and that you can all hear me. My name's Chris Birkett. I'm Head of Regulation at the HTA with responsibility for our regulation of human bodies and parts, predominantly for anatomical training and the related policy development. I also have responsibilities for our regulation of human tissue research, and I'll be giving the second webinar for that sector on Wednesday, if you missed the first one a couple of weeks ago and it applies to you. I'm joined by Maria Sakaris, our Stakeholder Engagement Manager, who will be making sure that everything else runs smoothly for the rest of the webinar. I believe we're expecting around 26 participants from around the UK, so thank you all for joining us. If anyone has any trouble with the technology during the webinar, can you please let us know by sending us a message through the chat pane, and we'll attempt to fix it if we can. Before I take you through the changes to our anatomy sector code, I wanted to remind you of the status of our codes. Here's an extract from Part 2 of the Human Tissue Act, which I'll also read out. The HTA may, in carrying out its functions with respect to licenses, take into account any relevant observance of or failure to observe a code of practice when dealing with a matter dealt with in a code. This emphasises that the codes are important resources for you to draw on and rely upon in terms of demonstrating your compliance with the regulatory framework. The Human Tissue Act also stipulates that codes should give practical guidance and set out the licensing standards. This webinar is happening at the end of work that began in the autumn of 2014 to review and revise our codes and standards. In 2015, we carried out a full public consultation and held workshops in London, Leeds, Belfast and Bridgend, attended by around 200 people. Responses were positive and constructive, and I'm sure many of you will have contributed or at least followed developments with interest. The codes and standards finally received parliamentary approval in December, which means, as planned, they will come into force on the 3rd of April and we'll begin regulating under them from that date. The proposed codes and standards have been on our website for over a year, and we've worked hard to provide lots of information about them on our website and through general and specific newsletters. In other words, nothing in this webinar should be a surprise to anyone, but it's useful to have a refresher before the revised codes and standards come into force. Just a reminder that our new suite of codes comprises of 7 rather than 9. We no longer have separate codes on disposal or on import and export. Guidance on these topics is in the individual codes where it's relevant. The idea behind that is so that the advice is tailored more to the needs of each sector. Code A is the overarching code and includes information that anyone involved in licensed activity should read, regardless of sector. We've had 2 webinars on that code, and a recording will be made available on our website. The purpose of this webinar is to take you through the main changes to the anatomy sector code and standards, with an emphasis on how these might impact your day-to-day work. The last major revision of the anatomy sector code was in 2009, but our standards have not changed since we began inspecting, and we've taken this opportunity to undertake a full review. But more about the standards a bit later. This next slide will be familiar to those people who attended the consultation workshops. It just gives a visual reminder of the changes we've made to the suite of codes. The import and export and disposal codes have gone, and those topics are covered in the relevant sector codes. And also you can see from this slide that Code A is the overarching code, and all sector codes should be read alongside this one. So in terms of the anatomy code itself, in general terms, what's different? Well, as discussed, there is now disposal and import and export information. More than half of the code content is new, which means it's either completely new, or it's text that has come from an existing code of practice, or it's updated text from one of the decommissioned codes, or it's modified other text. So sometimes there's guidance published between codes that has now made it into the code. There are also examples, in particular, are issues that have arisen from inspections and inquiries. So as a result, very little has actually been removed. Text has been added, so it's a bigger code. In terms of the specifics, what's different? Well, there's new information which includes more examples to reflect current practices. There is guidance on the acceptance of donor consent, which is actually text from a position statement that was published between codes and has now made it into the most recent version of this code that we're about to come into force on the 3rd of April. That gives guidance for those situations where the wording of consent is unclear, for example, in wills. There's also improved clarity on the guidance for loan arrangements and satellites. As I alluded to earlier, import and export guidance, which is new, but drawn from the import and export code that's been decommissioned, and also from published material that didn't make it into the previous code revision, but can now come into the current code. Import is particularly relevant to this sector code because of the frozen material, which is often imported for training purposes. Which is why on the slide you'll see I've made reference to new content on fresh frozen material. In terms of disposal, compared to the code that it's replacing, the new code has got an expanded section on disposal. This takes in text from the decommissioned disposal code. And there's also text on charging and cost recovery. The guidance here covers charges and transparency about charging with respect to the information used to support the seeking of consent from donors. It also emphasises that you can charge for providing material, but underscores the importance of transparency in ensuring informed consent. We also recommend that you provide information on how and why you charge and to whom material may be supplied. So that's a quick run through the code and the main changes. I'd now like to go into the detail of the revised standards a bit more. And the first thing at this point is that I want to emphasize that I'm confident you'll be familiar with what we expect. And that's because our data shows that the anatomy sector is a high-performing sector and that the principles that underpin our expectations haven't changed. So although the revised standards do raise the bar, you already have a good idea of where the bar is set. And because the revised standards have been available for over a year, you'll be familiar with them. In this next section on the standards, I want to explain how we've gone about revising them and then give you the information you need in order to check that you meet them. So more usefully, I'll be telling you what our inspectors will be looking for. In terms of setting about and revising the licensing standards, the context to this and the background is that we've had 10 years with the same licensing standards. Now that means we've got 10 years of experience of which standards work well. It also means we have 10 years of hard data, compliance data to check against our thoughts and feelings about the evidence and the qualitative evidence we had. So we felt the codes weren't out of date, but we felt that the standards were due a major review. So the review of our standards has provided the opportunity to reflect the changes that we've seen in the sector since we began inspecting. Overall, we found that many of the standards continued to fulfill their purpose, which was really to enable us to make judgments about the suitability of licensed premises and the practices taking place there. So we started off with a few objectives, which was really to make them clearer, to achieve better compliance, to raise the bar, to reflect the learning gained from 10 years of regulation, and to improve our ability to make use of the information that we get back from inspections. We decided early on that we would maintain consistency across our sectors. So whichever licensed activity you're involved with, you'll still be required to meet standards on consent, governance and quality, traceability, and premises, facilities, and equipment. This will be particularly useful for anyone who works across sectors or for our DIs who are taking responsibility for an area outside their normal area, for example, a research tissue bank, which I know we have a couple of in the anatomy sector. We look back at our inspections data to assess the continued relevance of each standard and the patterns of compliance to identify where there was scope to remove a standard or strengthen it or to add a new one. We obtained early input from sector experts as critical friends, and we involved our regulation managers whose knowledge individually and collectively about how our establishments are meeting our standards has been important in informing where we should place more emphasis. We also made sure that our revised standards continued to meet the requirements of the Regulators Code and that our approach was consistent with good regulation. Regulators must have regard to the code when developing policies and operational procedures that guide their regulatory activities and when setting standards or giving guidance. Amongst other things, we must carry out our activities in a way that supports those we regulate to comply, provide simple and straightforward ways to engage with those we regulate and hear their views, and base our regulatory activities on risk and provide clear information, guidance and advice to help those we regulate meet their responsibilities to comply. So, in terms of the most notable and noticeable changes to the standards, the most obvious thing is that the standards have been restructured. We've removed specific standards for disposal and introduced new standards for traceability. We've also consolidated standards where there are similarities to create clearer and more specific standards. These set a higher standard, but we believe it will be easier for establishments to understand how to meet the standards and what is expected from them. I'm sure some of you will have looked at the revised standards on the website and will have noticed the change in formatting and structure. Till now, in other words, currently, we have 17 individually numbered standards, for example, C1, C2, C3, PFE 1 to 5, etc. And each of those has examples below them of establishments can evidence their compliance against the standard. Now, this is allowed for flexibility, but it's sometimes left establishments unclear about what precisely they have to do to demonstrate that the standard is met. So taking the examples of evidence together, the current anatomy sector standards amount to 59 possible requirements, and the new set of standards consist of 47 separate standards, which seems proportionate and fair. A further benefit of this change in structure and format is that we'll more easily be able to undertake analyses of inspection findings and feed these back to the sector about trends in compliance. A really important development is the inclusion of standard-specific guidance. These items of guidance are not contained in the published code, but they are available as a separate document. And actually, on the website at the moment, if you check the post-consultation version of the code, you will see the sector-specific guidance, the standard-specific guidance contained in Annex B of that code. But as I say, going forward, we will have a separate document which contains the standards plus the guidance. And this separation means we can readily review and update the supporting guidance on an ongoing basis, which will mean we can reflect current good practices and share learning across the sectors as time goes by. And that way, we hope to keep pace with the way that your work evolves, and you'll always be able to refer to an up-to-date guidance document. So I want to try and explain how we've restructured the standards. I'm sure you'll have seen them, but just to explain in terms of the current standards, each standard, so for example GQ2, is supported by examples of how establishments can demonstrate their compliance against GQ2. And for all these standards, these are often used as a checklist, these examples. So if we take GQ2 as the example here on the slide, the standard is there is a documented system of quality management and audit, and below that there are 3 examples of how you can meet that standard, the things that we're looking for you to demonstrate. If I move on to the next slide, The revised GQ2 looks like this. So the new standards are grouped under an overarching statement or theme, which makes them more specific. And as you'll see from the draft code that's on our website, these are accompanied by guidance notes, which provide guidance and set out our expectations to help you to meet the standard. So in this example on audits, the guidance notes cover matters such as why audits are important, the different types of audits that can be or should be done, and how audits should be managed and carried out. And don't worry that the original GQ2 included aspects of quality management. These haven't been lost, but they've been included in specific standards of their own with guidance notes as well. So after that sort of scene setting exercise, I want to actually take you through the standards themselves. And this, I hope, will be useful because it will essentially tell you what our inspectors are looking for. So I hope that'll be really useful. So now the consent standards, instead of 3, we've now got 2 standards, C1 and C2. The reason for that is that there was a lot of duplication, or at least we've added together the old C1 and C2 to create the new C1. And C1 is about consent being obtained in accordance with the Act and the codes of practice. And so the standards underneath C1 will cover the forms and procedural documents that relate to consent. Where relevant, they'll cover agreements with third parties and also the information that's used to support consent, which was covered under the old C2 consent standard. In terms of the guidance notes for C1, there is guidance which covers consideration of legal requirements such as the Data Protection Act and the common law duty of confidentiality. There is guidance which covers the content of agreements with other parties responsible for seeking consent, so that the consent is obtained in accordance with the Act and the codes of practice. There's also guidance about optimizing the transparency of information used to support consent seeking, essentially so that all the potential uses for bodies and material are covered in that consent information. Now, just a little aside here, we have had some questions in advance of the event, which are about how you can assess and approve courses and classes and particular delegates for the material that you hold. Just to allude to these questions, I just wanted to point to the fact that we published guidance back in November, which is not that long ago, but unfortunately it missed the code because of the timing. But we published guidance which went out in a newsletter, but is also on the website, which is to do with improving body donation information to support informed consent. And that guidance, I think, will help with those questions that have been sent in. There are also FAQs how you can improve the transparency of the information you provide to donors. So I'll just say that I will get back to the people who've submitted those questions, but also I think I need to think about perhaps doing a newsletter item for everyone else about assessing suitability of courses and delegates. So we'll take that away with us if we may. Just getting back to C1, we also signpost to our model documents, which are consent forms and the bequeathal booklet that we provide on the website. In terms of C2, consent standard C2, the overarching theme here is about training and support for staff seeking consent. And the standards underneath C2 cover the records to support that, and also this idea and this important concept that competency in training is demonstrated and maintained. In terms of the guidance notes to accompany C2, they cover concepts such as consent training is not considered a one-off event and that proficiency is upheld. Plus there's some general advice on training good practice, for example, on the frequency of training. Moving on to the governance and quality systems standards. There are 6 of these altogether. But on this slide, we're covering GQ1 and GQ2. GQ1, the theme for this group of standards is really about having a good system of documented policies, procedures, and governance. And the standards underneath this theme allude to having approved, robust documents that people follow, about having document control, governance meetings to support the governance arrangements, and also a complaint system. And one include guidance on the expected the SOPs, in other words, the ones we will be looking for on inspection, guidance on structuring of SOPs, how SOPs should be managed, and the specifications for SOPs. We give document control advice, including the features of document control and version control. We give advice on the governance structure, for example, about meetings, and we also give guidance on the quality management framework. In terms of GQ2 and the standards that link to this theme is about having a documented system of audit, and the standards below this theme include having a schedule of audits and also how audits should be managed. And the advice that is included to help you understand these standards covers auditing good practice from our perspective. So, for example, the types of audit and how audit arrangements can underpin good governance. Just moving on to the next two standards under GQ. We've got GQ3 and GQ4. GQ3 is about general staff training. So the standards underneath this theme are to do with having training records, that people do have an induction process, and that people are appraised and have personal development plans. So the guidance notes for GQ3 include guidance on general good practice on training, but actually not very much, as the standards themselves are very specific and straightforward to follow. In terms of GQ4, this focuses on record management, and the standards underneath this theme cover the creation, review, amendment, retention, and destruction of records. There's also a standard which relates to backup and recovery of records, and also a standard which relates to systems supporting data protection, confidentiality, and public disclosure. And so the guidance notes for GQ4 include guidance on the format and storage of records, and make reference to other relevant legislation on personal data and confidentiality. And then moving on to GQ5 and GQ6. GQ5 is about adverse events. So the standards under GQ5 are that staff know what to do in the advent of an adverse event, and they know how to recognise one, and also a standard about corrective and preventative actions and follow-up to adverse events. And the guidance notes on GQ5 include guidance on adverse incident handling, in other words, the features of a good system. And just to emphasise, as it does in the guidance, that there's currently no requirement to report adverse incidents to the HTA. There's no mandatory requirement, but we do encourage you to contact us, and on that basis, we do provide illustrative examples in the guidance to help you with that. In terms of GQ6, GQ6 is about risk assessments, and so the standards underneath GQ6 include that risk assessments must be documented and cover the human tissue act risks, if you like, that they must be reviewed regularly, and that staff are aware of them and have training. The guidance notes that accompany those standards cover what the risk assessments should include, what risks should be assessed. So we provide you with a list of those risks, and we also give guidance generally on good practice for risk assessment, for example, when they should be reviewed. So I'm now going to move on to the traceability standards. Now this is a new group, so this is T1 and T2. When I say this is a new group, the principles that are covered are not new at all. It's just we've restructured this because traceability is so important, as you know, from our audit trails on inspection, and we've taken in disposal into traceability to recognise that disposal is the key endpoint to traceability in most cases. So In terms of traceability standards, there are two of them. T1, the first one, covers coding and records to facilitate traceability and audit. And the standards under T1 cover that there must be unique codes, that there must be a register of material. It covers full auditability. So there's a standard that covers that requirement, including transport and transfer. There's also a standard around records, and that might relate to transport or delivery, transfer and courier arrangements. And the guidance notes for T1 include general guidance on maintaining traceability, plus guidance on loan agreement records, and also references to our model templates. T2 is essentially the new disposal requirements, and that includes two standards underneath that theme. The first one being that the disposal is in accordance with the codes, and the second one being about how disposal needs to be properly documented. And in the guidance notes to support those standards, there's general guidance on disposal records and documentation. So I'm now going to move on to the final group of standards, and these are premises, facilities and equipment, PFE1 to PFE3. So 3 standards altogether. PFE1 is to do with premises being secure and fit for purpose. I've abbreviated that for FFP there, but fit for purpose, not fresh frozen plasma for the clinicians. The standards below PFE1 are to ensure that an assessment of the premises has been carried out to make sure that they are fit for purpose, that premises are secure and that confidentiality is maintained, and also that the premises have documented cleaning and decontamination procedures. The guidance notes for PFA1 include guidance on establishments being clean, well maintained, subject to a program of planned preventative maintenance, that there is a periodic review of risk assessments for the premises, facilities and equipment, that there are environmental controls to avoid contamination, that there are security measures, that there are policies to review and maintain the safety of staff, visitors and other relevant people, for example, medical students or surgeons or doctors or other professions, and also that there are guidance about cleaning and decontamination procedures supported by schedules. In terms of PFE2 is about storage being appropriate, and so there are specific standards on having sufficient capacity, that the dignity of the deceased is ensured, that storage conditions are monitored, recorded and acted on when required, and that there are documented contingency plans. The guidance around PFE2 goes into detail about temperature monitoring and how that can be and should be documented, and also the idea that trending of those monitoring records can help to detect failures in storage before they happen. Also, there's guidance about defining and signposting alarm set points, minimum, maximum temperatures where appropriate and where needed. There's also some guidance about remote monitoring and call-out systems, particularly for frozen material, and also where material can be stored at ambient room temperature. That doesn't mean that storage conditions don't need to be monitored at all. So there's some advice about that. There's also some general guidance about maintaining a safe environment for staff, about labelling storage equipment, which is principally about maintaining quality and safety and security, and preventing mix-ups as well with other tissues. And then finally, because I couldn't fit it onto that slide without making it look terrible, we've got PFE3, which is really about the equipment that's used. And so there are standards here which cover the calibration, validation, maintenance and monitoring of equipment. There's also a standard which is really about users of equipment and making sure that they have instructions and know how to report any problems in equipment, and that staff are provided with appropriate personal protective equipment. So the guidance notes for PFE3 include guidance on good practice principles on equipment being appropriate for use, and also having a system to renew items that are no longer serviceable. So that's it in terms of the standards, and sort of galloping through those. But I did just want to include a slide on the categorisation of shortfalls, which I hope most of you will be familiar with the way that we work, because it's the basis on which we determine that a shortfall against the standard is minor, major, or critical. But I did just want to, I'm not going to read out everything on the slide. I'm hoping that you will be familiar with this idea of a minor, a major, or a critical. But overall, I did want to just say, as I have done on numerous other occasions, that compliance in the anatomy sector is very good. In our review of the anatomy sector inspections, which we published in 2015, there was only one major shortfall in 24 inspections conducted over 4 years. And more importantly, there were no shortfalls at all in 15 of those 24 inspections, which is 63%. So, you know, this is a very good, very compliant, generally low risk sector. So I hope that with the new standards, you'll continue to meet them, and certainly look forward to continuing to support you in the months and years ahead.